Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for being here. If you haven't been to Beaufort to see the Pat Conroy Literary Center, go do that as soon as you can. Jonathan runs the place, and it's exceptional. It's a great place. I am here today with three very different fiction writers. I think that'll make for an interesting conversation. Anne Hite is the author of 6 novels, I believe, 5 of them on Black Mountain novels, so we'll talk about that some. She also wrote a searing memoir of her family history, a very complicated history like many of us here in the South have. She lives in Powder Springs, or near Powder Springs, and she was the Georgia Author of the Year in 2012.
Yes.
And then Jackson Pearce she has written mostly books for teenagers. And
no one's taking photos. How will you remember later? I'll go slow.
All right. Okay. I think they've got it. And she teaches writing classes to teenagers, which has got to be an interesting thing to do. So we'll talk about that some later, too. And Tiphanie Yanique teaches at Emory currently. It's from the U.S. Virgin Islands originally, and that flavors a lot of her fiction. This is your second novel, I believe?
Yes.
Is that right?
It's my second novel, but my 5th book.
Okay. She started out of the gate really early and was one of the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35 in 2010. She's won a Fulbright Pushcart Prize. I mean, all of the prestigious prizes. So we're very happy to have her here today.
Just all of the prestigious prizes.
All of them.
They're just a Grammy.
There are too many to list. You know?
Nobel.
But no, I'm thrilled that everybody's here today, and I think this will be a fun talk. Why don't we start? All the books are new or new in paperback. So why don't you just give if I just start with Anne, and if you just give like the 30-second elevator pitch about basic plot and what your book's about.
Well, after I finished writing the horrible memoir that took up and gutted me, I wanted to do something fun. So I went on Facebook and asked my readers to send me answers to questions about their family, and I picked certain ones to use as writing prompts and wrote short stories. So it's a haunted collection of short stories. It's ghost stories set in the South.
Nice.
Jackson?
Mine is a thinly veiled Taylor Swift rom-com. And the publishing company has said that I should distance myself from calling it a thinly veiled Taylor Swift rom-com and just be like, it's a pop music book, but like, y'all look at the cover. It's a thinly veiled Taylor Swift rom-com about singer Vivi Swan, who's my Taylor Swift analog, who uses breakups to kind of spur her creativity. And she and her tour drummer, fall in love, but it's this big question of like, is this just for the creativity? Is this just for that, or is this an actual relationship? And there's like newspaper articles and gossip blog columns in it. It's fun.
Yay. I'm going to be reading from Monster in the Middle, which will be out in paperback next month, but I think they're available here just for y'all. It's a novel about 2 families and how they teach each other what love means. And the concept is that we learn what love is by hearing stories from our parents and about like thinking through our own early childhood loves and our sexy mistakes that we made in high school and college. And that all those things teach us what love means and why we choose to do this really complicated, insane, not smart thing, but that we are all striving for, which is to find the love of our lives. So it's a sexy romance, but smart.
Well, those are great elevator pitches. Y'all are all good at that. It occurs to me sitting in this room looking at all these wonderful people, writing is a solitary endeavor. That certainly didn't change during COVID, but COVID added kind of a layer of intensity to it. And I wonder just if it affected you, if COVID affected like you as a writer, your writing process, what it did to you those... Yeah, with 2.5 years, we're kind of still in it, but not really. So maybe start with Tiphanie. Did it affect you or how?
Yeah, I actually wrote a lot during COVID. I don't know if that's because I wasn't alone. I have a bunch of kids, and I was, as many of those of you who are parents, I was like a full-time kindergarten, first grade and third grade teacher for 2 years straight. I was also like teaching other people's kids too, because my kids were in pods and stuff. And for me anyway, having less time makes me more disciplined. And it's when I don't have a lot of time that's actually harder for me to write, because I want to like go to the beach and like hang out with people and like call my friends. But when I have less time, I just get really fierce in the discipline. So I wrote a ton. I actually haven't written quite so much now that we're opening up a bit. But I also, I was invited to write a lot of stuff about Blackness and parenting and COVID. And I've started to think through how all those things might be connected, the ways in which maybe like people of color were more vulnerable during the COVID pandemic and also during Black Lives Matter. So that also I was asked by the world, like the people would ask me to write essays about this during the pandemic. So now I've started writing about that too. So yeah, I hate to say that it was good for my writing. That's an awful thing to say, right? Like,
yeah, but I get it.
Screw her.
I mean, yeah.
Screw me.
Yeah.
But it was.
Jackson, what about you?
So during the pandemic, it was very bad for my writing. So all of my writing tricks went out the window. So I am somebody that I would always find like a new coffee shop to go to, and I would write the entire book at this one coffee shop. And then that coffee shop would be dead to me, because when I went to that coffee shop, I'd be like, oh, I remember writing that one book here. And I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to those coffee shops. I couldn't, it interrupted a lot of I used to spent a lot of time doing school visits and stuff. That was out the window. And so that's when I started doing a lot of online teaching. And that was helpful for my writing in some ways, but it also, at the end of the day, I don't want to get back on the computer.
Yeah.
Because I've been on the computer all day doing online teaching. So it's been very tricky. I've had to change my approach to writing. Like I said, I used to go to a coffee shop and I would sit there for 4, 5, 6 hours. And work all day. And I couldn't do that anymore. But I'm not gonna sit at my kitchen table for 4, 5, 6 hours and write. I can't just move that process somewhere else. So I've been doing a lot more, I'm gonna write for 5 minutes. That's all you have to do, Pierce, 5 minutes, and you got this, okay? Or if you write for 10 minutes, then you can watch the next episode of Is It Cake? And find out if it's cake. And I've been doing a lot of bargaining. It's been hard. It's been really hard. Like, I wish I could tell you that in a lot of ways the pandemic was, there were elements of the pandemic that were, I don't want to say useful to me, because again, it makes me sound like a bad person, but there were elements that were useful in that regard. I got a lot more reading done, but in terms of writing, it's been really hard for me.
Anne?
Well, I wrote this book during the pandemic, so it worked really well for me. And I feel bad saying that, but I had a really busy, crazy life, and all of a sudden, I didn't have anything I had to do except write. And so it was a choice of sit around and think about what's going to happen next, or just use my writing to kind of escape, which is what I do. So that's how I handled it.
Back in the green room, Ann, you and I were talking about the literary events and doing them over Zoom, and how there were some good things about that, in that you could reach people far
Right.
away, and you could see authors who weren't in your same town, that kind of thing. But the romance wore off for me. I mean,
It did for me, most definitely. I felt like I did the Southern Book Festival in Nashville, and we did it online. And all I was looking at is myself. And I'm very introverted, so I thought, oh, I'll enjoy this. This will be easy, because I won't have to see who's out there. And it wasn't, because I didn't realize how much I used the audience to talk to. And it was miserable, because I thought, oh, I'm going to mess up. I'm going to stumble because I'm talking to myself, So I didn't care for it. I loved it as a person attending.
Yeah.
Because I could go all over the world and watch things that I couldn't go to. But I didn't care for it to be the person that they were interviewing.
Yeah. How important are these kind of literary events to, Jackson, I'll start with you, to your writing, how you approach your writing?
Oh, they're huge. Yeah. So again, this is actually my first adult event, because the other 15 books that I've written have all been for kids. So usually there's at least one person picking their nose blatantly in the crowd, and none of you are doing that. So
not so far.
I don't know how to feel about that. Yeah. But
They're wearing masks. We can't tell.
yeah, we'll never know. But yeah, it's weird not. There was a big part of my career, honestly, just in terms of that. Honestly, is an additional source of income for a lot of writers. Going to school visits, going to libraries, doing these sort of tours, selling books. That's a part of the job, and to have that part of the job completely go away, both in terms of how you recognize and relate to your audience, but also just in terms financially, was very, very tricky. I really miss doing school visits. I have my first actual big school visit later in 2 weeks, I think.
Oh, great.
And it will be the first one. But I've been teaching online, so I'm like, what will I do now that I can see everybody has legs? What will happen? I don't know. But now, the thing about doing the online with kids, and again, I know this isn't a kids panel, sorry. But online with kids, when they're picking their nose, they like to get really close to the camera to do it. They love that. They love to watch the action. And so I am excited about it being at a distance again. And I can be like, I see you picking your nose, but not that well. I don't see it that well. So, yeah, it's a big part of it. What about?
Now, Tiphanie, I'll even complicate the issue even further with you. You teach at graduate and undergraduate level. Mm-hmm. How does that teaching writing? I've talked to some authors who find that it really helps them in their own writing because it reminds you of the basics. You have to go over the same things that you have to remember as a writer all the time too, so it actually helps. But tell me how you incorporate teaching into your writing. Is it a good thing or a bad thing, or does it get in the way?
You know, writers sometimes say nonsense, like there was nothing else I could be doing except for writing. I would starve. I'm like, what a dumb, privileged thing to say. You would work at McDonald's, you would do something else, right? But for me, it would always be teaching. I love teaching. It inspires me, it fills me. My students at Emory are brilliant. Some of them I think are even here. What up? And they write beautifully, they're smart, they challenge me. And you know, we don't really do a lot of the basics. I am always trying to elevate my students and pull them up. Like, a thing I tell my students on day one is you will all fail, so just come and do your best. Like nobody's gonna get an A. Like you're doomed. I'm here to destroy you. And I mean, part of it is that I want to just like pull them up as high as possible. So even in my intro classes, I'm still teaching them with the same kind of language that I teach my graduate students. So for me, it's a very elevated experience, and I feel like I'm talking to fellow writers. So it's very inspiring for me. And I often go after class and write, because they just like really pull me up. So, teaching is what I would be doing if I wasn't writing. So, yeah, I love it.
I've got a follow up. So, do you give advice though, and you hear yourself doing it? Like you hear yourself saying the advice, and you're like, I should really do that. Like as you give the advice, you're like, that's a good idea.
Well, usually I'm giving advice that I already take. You know, like it's advice that I'm like.
That's the secret.
Yeah, they're paying I'm trying so hard not to curse because there's a cross behind them. They're paying a lot of money.
This is not the sanctuary. You can say anything.
I feel like the classroom might as well be a church. It's a sacred space to me, and I want it to be that way for my students. And that we're coming to do like God's work in that classroom. So for me, when I talk to my students, I'm only telling them things that I really believe in already. Even though I'll say to them, this is what I believe. Another teacher might tell you something totally different, and they're not wrong. But I'm giving you the things that I know to be true, that I have proven to myself to be true in my own writing. So when you take a class from me, you're getting like me, like my knowledge, my expertise. Yeah.
I'm gonna sign up for Tiffany's
Come
classes.
on. Except you're gonna fail like everybody else.
That's okay. You somehow make me feel
They don't
good
really
about
fail.
that.
You're not gonna really fail. I promise. Yeah.
Why are they crying?
So, Anne, you write a lot about ghosts.
Yes.
Tell me, let's talk about that. Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from, my grandmother was from Appalachia, and she raised me from 10 up. I had lived in Germany in a military family, and when we moved back, I went to live with my grandmother. That was in the 1964, 65. So I'm telling my age. And it was a culture shock for me, because I was used to very diverse and just a whole different. And I came back to small town Marietta, and she was from Appalachia, and every month we went to see her sisters up in Appalachia, which was really a cultural shock for me, but I would learn to be really quiet and sit off in the room, and all the other cousins would be outside going crazy, and and I'd listen to the stories. And they believed in, ghosts. Ghosts was just part of life for them, It's a different kind of ghost than horror. They did try to shelve my first book, Ghost on Black Mountain, in horror. And, people that read horror would hiss at it and throw it across the room because it's more about good old Southern Appalachian ghosts. They don't do too bad of stuff. They don't scare you too bad. So, but for me, it was just a natural thing to put ghosts in some of the folklore.
And you set it up really well in this book. Would you mind reading the first paragraph for us?
Oh, I would love to.
I think it sets kind of the tone of the rest of the book in a really beautiful way.
Well, thank you. And this first story is about this collection of stories actually ended up being, I didn't intend it to be kind of connected. Mm-hmm. So this is Polly's story, and Polly, she comes from the actual writing prompt that the reader gave me, but also I had just found out that my second great-grandmother was full Cherokee, and so I decided to write something about her. So this is the first paragraph. Souls have always wandered the thick forest of Black Mountain. My elders spoke of their moans that soak the air in the time between dark and light, a sacred time, a protective time. Who were the souls? I wasn't told this, only that the mountain collected them and would for eternity. But I grew up walking paths around the mountain, playing in the streams and the river. I could walk them in the black night without a decent light. My grandmother called me tree walker. The souls allowed me to be part of their trails. There were times when I was sure footfalls followed me, but when I turned, no one was there, just a mountain laurel moving in the stillness. Always I knew they were looking out for me.
That's really nice.
Thank you.
So
I have a follow-up question. So are any of the stories in there they're all from prompts from other people, or are any of them your ghost stories?
Well, the rule I set for myself when they turned in, it could be 2 sentences that they could turn in.
Okay.
And I couldn't ask them any questions. Ooh. So it's not about theirs.
What's the scariest one in there?
So I
cannot read it. I would say,
I would say Take Me Home, because it's actually set in
the asylum.
In the asylum in
Milledgeville.
So yeah, but my books are about strong women, very strong women. That's a theme in all of my books, and especially in the short stories, is the choices that they make or they don't make. And so while the scary stuff is in there, it's also you're going to take away a lot more than just the scary stuff. But the scary stuff's fun.
I lived in Milledgeville. I went to school for 2 years there. And has anyone seen the asylum in Milledgeville?
It's pretty scary.
Yeah. So there's this beautiful building at the very, very end, and that's the new building. But they can't tear the old buildings down because they're historically protected, and they are nightmare fuel. Nightmare fuel. And they have bars on the windows, and you have to drive past them to get to the pretty one. And now I really want to read it. I'm not gonna lie.
Okay, my work is done here. So Tiphanie, let's talk about your book. The second novel it's structured in. There's so much going on, and it tells the story of kind of a new relationship through the prism of lots of old relationships and family histories. It's fascinating. It's a lot to wrangle. What was the biggest challenge for you in telling this story?
Oh, the book took me 14 years to write.
Well, that's something.
So I would say just figuring out the structure was already really complex. And originally there were stories that were not connected that I began to weave together. I feel like I'm teaching my class. I am teaching a class right now at Emory called Link Story Collections that's based on what I've learned in putting this story collection, which is actually a novel, together. But yeah, just figuring out the structure was really tough. It's also a book about what it means to be American and about American history. I mean, I'm American. I'm a U.S. citizen by birth, and and because of where I live and all that. But I'm also this sort of strange version of American because I'm from the Virgin Islands. I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands, but a lot of Americans don't think of us as Americans. And so when I come to America, sometimes I experience that as an immigration. So I was sort of thinking through what does it mean to be an American person, especially given the way that America is so complex right now, let's say. And there's a lot of judgment about who gets to be a real American right now. So I was thinking about that a lot when I was writing this book. And so each chapter takes place in a different part of the U.S. and also at a different point in our history, so that we're meeting the characters at also points that are shared moments in American culture history. So we begin with the Challenger explosion, which I don't know if you guys, some of you guys weren't alive, but I remember as a kid when that happened. So things that we shared together that maybe have knitted us as Americans, and that those are the touchstones in each of the chapters. And at some points, figuring out what was going to be the touchstone was also tricky, and I had to change it depending. The way that I had written the book, part of why it took me 14 years is that at one point I thought that the election in 2016 was going to go a different way.
A lot of us did.
And so I was wrapping the book up with this idea of our first woman president. And I was so positive I'd written those last chapters already. And then I got screwed. So as maybe we all did. But so then I had to rewrite the book and rethink about what were going to be the touchstones for those last couple of years. So COVID-19 ends up being a big part of it. So does the Black Lives Matter protests. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that was hard to pull together.
Yeah.
What's the name of the book, please?
The name of the book is called Monster in the Middle. Yeah, thank you for asking. Monster in the Middle.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask questions? Is this okay?
Well, apparently so.
Okay. I've got a microphone. You can't stop me. The Challenger explosion is such a interesting touchstone. Were there any that's an unexpected touchstone that I wouldn't necessarily think of that as a galvanizing moment, but it is?
So one thing that was not really particularly American that made its way into the book was Princess Diana and what's his name getting married. Yeah, I like that, huh? The new king of England, whoever he is, which actually it was important in America. I remember us watching it on TV, and I was a little kid, and it still ended up being important even in the U.S. And so that is not an American. It wasn't part of our national history, and it was part of our cultural history. So that's one of the ones that made its way into the book.
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Can you read a little bit for us?
I would be so thrilled to. I'm going to do as Teresa instructed and read from just the very beginning of the book. And the beginning of the book is a letter.
I didn't instruct as much as suggest.
Well, I feel like you instructed because, you're the boss. And
Sometimes I have a tone.
You're a little scary to me anyway. And I believe in authority, So this first chapter it's called Love Letter. And it is a letter. Every story in the collection or every chapter is written in a different, form of fiction. So I'm also interested in what it means to tell stories. So this one is in a form of a letter. And I'll just read it. Dear loves, when you fall in love, you will be certain that it is something special about that other person. Isn't that what the songs on the radio make us think? Or maybe you will be smart enough to know it's also something special about you, because that is what the therapists on the TV get paid to help you understand. Am I right? You already know that you will bring baggage into this new love thing because it's modern times and you've heard the word baggage. But baggage is not the most of it, We know. Because listen, sweet ones, you are not falling in love with that one person. It's that you're bringing it all. You're bringing us. It's like how them old-timey folks used to say that when two people get married, it's two families coming together. Or another way to understand it is that when you meet your love, you are meeting all the people who ever loved them or who were supposed to love them but didn't love them enough, or hell, didn't love them at all. You feel where this is going, my loves? Please pay attention, knuckleheads, because it's going regardless. Love your parents.
Okay, Jackson, you've written a love story set in pop music.
I have.
So, yeah. Yeah, we've seen that. So so tell me where that came from. What inspired that?
So I have always been fascinated by pop culture. For a lot of different reasons. I have particularly always been fascinated by the difference in how we treat men in pop culture and women in pop culture. I find that very, very intriguing that the things that male artists of any ilk, like actors, singers, songwriters, dancers, like of any ilk, what they can do in the name of creativity is very different than what women can do in the name of creativity. My best, most modern example of this, or most recent example, is Britney Spears versus Charlie Sheen. And when Charlie Sheen like went off the handle and was like talking about drinking tiger's blood and what have you, it was like, oh, Charlie, he's so crazy, isn't he? What a weird guy. And when Britney went off the handle, she got all of her rights taken away and lost control of her bodily autonomy, financial autonomy, all of these things. When they both had mental illness, they got treated in very different ways. One was treated as this is just how men are creative, and the other was treated as somebody make that woman sit down. And especially with a figure, especially with pop stars, especially young female pop stars, the way that they are this combination of like, you have to be sexy, but not sexy like that. And you have to make sure you're appealing to a wide audience, but not too wide of an audience. And you have to make sure that your song is a song that everybody wants to dance to, but it can't be like too similar to another song, otherwise you're just a copycat. And all of these restrictions that we put on artistry and female artistry, and then how, honestly, and I'm a part of it, how we all just watch it and delight in it, right? And eat popcorn while we watch the shenanigans go down. That's always been very, very interesting to me, and especially with a figure like, again, like Taylor Swift, who is using her personal life in so many ways to write these songs, and suddenly that was a bad thing. And it was like, oh, you should be writing impersonal songs. But if you write impersonal songs, your music isn't deep enough. It's not meaningful enough. So how can you win? And you can't, because it's not even a game, really. I always found her to be a very interesting pop culture figure. But I wanted to write a story about that combination of, you know, this is a pop culture icon, but this is also a person at the end of the day. I remember when Miley Cyrus got divorced from one of the Hemsworths. Liam. I was about to say Chris. I was like, she wasn't married to Thor. But I remember when she got divorced from him, and it was like, God, this is like, she has so much, right? She has everything. Kim Kardashian's another example. She has so much, but still her relationship is falling apart, right? And still she's having trouble making this work, and that's so identifiable. And yet I'm also watching it like it's entertainment. And that seems problematic at the same time, you know? And it's kind of the way it works, I guess, sometimes, but it's a very unfair system. What a long-winded answer to your question.
No judgment. Do you want to read a little bit? You didn't want to read the first paragraph, though, like I instructed.
I know. I broke the rules. Somebody tell me if she gets up and like lifts it. No. Yeah. So I'm going to read actually the very beginning of chapter 5. So this is when the story is told from the point of view of the drummer, the tour drummer. It's a male point of view. And this is the first night out when they're on the tour, when they're on her tour together. So it's the beginning of chapter 5. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
30,000 people screaming didn't sound like people at all. They sounded like a lion or a thunderstorm or an earthquake, something alive and infinitely powerful and beautiful and dangerous. Seattle, opening night of an arena tour, and 30,000 strong hurricane was roaring. Remy was seated at his drum set, which was below the stage. Hydraulics would lift him up moments before the first song began. Up on stage, videos played of Vivi Swan writing her music, her talking to the camera about her process. The ground beneath him shifted, and he ascended, feeling a little too much like the tethered goat in Jurassic Park going up into the T-Rex pen. The single thing that was a 30,000 individual thing came into view. A clear plastic panel in front of Remy's drum set made it feel even more like he was watching the crowd through a two-way mirror. He saw them, but in the black, they didn't realize he was there. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to move slowly and deliberately, so as to not startle them and cause an attack. The light surged, Remy jumped, his eyes went wide. A moment of utter panic flashed through him, fight and flight and nausea, and then go. He kicked into action, spurred, thank God, by muscle memory from the rehearsals. He tapped off a beat, and David joined him on guitar. The crowd screamed a deafening pitch. Quiet Coyote's audiences had been so largely female, and he hadn't realized the sound of a crowd of women screaming would be so wildly different from the sound of a crowd of mixed gender screaming. The dancers slid onto the stage. The song began, timed to the first verse, growing smaller and smaller and smaller, and then, with a ripple from the keyboards, Vivi herself was launched from underneath the stage, dress bubbling around her like Marilyn's. I haven't read that out loud before. That was kind of a weird thing. We're all here together for it. It was nice.
How different was it writing for adults than writing for kids?
You know, because this was very much a passion project book. This is a book that I wrote in between other things. I just really wanted to write this particular story. And so I wasn't thinking that much about that until I started editing it. And the thing about writing for kids is I'm never writing any book to be like the morality police, right? I'm never writing a book to teach like a lesson. But with kids' books, I'm very aware of who will be reading this and the things they might take away from this. And, you know, this book might be their only introduction to this kind of person or somebody that likes this or this, you know, I'm very aware of that. And it was very strange feeling like I didn't have to be quite as aware of that and I could kind of play with it. And then also writing sex scenes is awkward. It's very strange and if I wrote this before the pandemic, and I remember I was at like a Starbucks, and I was like, and then they did it. Like, so that was a strange difference.
So what, this is kind of a general question that just popped into my head, but Anne, I'll start with you. What is the first book you remember really loving as a child?
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Is that right?
Yeah. Because it took you to a whole nother place. You could go into a closet. And as a child, I loved closets. And you could go away to another place. So for me, it was the best. That I remember just thinking. I came home and told my grandmother, wow, there's this new book called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And she said, that's not new. But yeah, I loved it.
What about you, Jackson? What do you remember?
You know, oddly enough, it's a book that I now realize is relatively problematic, but it was a book called The Indian in the Cupboard by Lynn Reid Banks. And it's problematic in a lot of ways, and I didn't recognize that at the time. I don't think many people did at the time. But I will say I did love it. And it was also the first book, there's a 4-book series, and the last one, I hated the ending because the parents find out about the secret, and that's not cool. So I hated the ending, and I actually rewrote the ending and folded it up and put it in the back of the book. And that was like when I would read it, I would read my ending.
That's why you became a writer.
I know, right? Yeah. And it is funny though that that could have such a profound effect and like impact on me wanting to be a storyteller. And yet at the same time, in retrospect, I'm like, ooh, there's some issues, some big issues with that book, right? But still.
But wanting to write the book, you're like wanting to change it, wanting to have your own ending. Like this story should be this way. I can do that.
And also identifying I think a big thing for writers, especially young writers, is identifying the parts of a story and how a story has like a structure. And I think that was I can follow the structure here, but then. Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to give my students this assignment, like rewrite the ending of your favorite book.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good one. It's a good assignment. No, they love it. They're nodding. They're like, yes. Okay, they don't love it. In my house, I was allowed to read any book that I could read. That was the rule. And I grew up with my grandparents. I didn't know my parents growing up. And my grandmother was a librarian, so she had tons of books. But a lot of them were really not appropriate for children. So like the books that I read as a kid were like Silence of the Lambs, like just awful shit. Oh, I cursed. But I read just really, I actually now hate horror and stuff like that because I read way too much of it as a kid. I also read a lot of like sultry, like Daniel Steele, like way too young. Because that was the rule. If you can read it, if you can figure out how to get through the sentences, you can read it, right? So it really wasn't until I was much older that I found a book that was like meant for me. And I remember it was actually when I went to college. I went to college in Boston, and my teacher had us read this book called Breath, Eyes, Memory. Do you guys know this book? Oh, yeah. It's called Breath, Eyes, Memory. It's by Edwidge Danticat. Somebody's clapping. They're like, it's my favorite book. Yeah. And Edwidge Danticat is a Haitian writer. She was very young at the time. She's actually not that much older than me, but she's way ahead of me in her career because she started writing that book when she was an undergrad at Barnard in New York. And so I read that book as an undergrad. She's probably like 6 years older than me, but she was already a famous writer at that point. And I remember going up to my teacher and saying, like, where did you get this? I didn't know that Black women from the Caribbean were writing books. Because even though I grew up with a literate family, my grandmother was a librarian, we grew up, as people who are colonized often do, only reading books from the States, from America. And we weren't reading Caribbean books at all. And we weren't even reading Caribbean American books. We weren't reading Black American books either. We were reading a lot of white American books. So I thought I was going to be the first one. I will be the first Black woman author.
So close.
Yeah, I mean. And then I remember being like, who is this person that you found? And then I opened up this whole
What's your
trove.
address? Because I know where to work.
Right. And now she's my friend, which is crazy. Right?
That's great.
Like I can call her and be like, hey, Edwidge, like, that's insane. But I'm definitely not the first. Yeah.
So when did you know that you were a writer?
I think having a house full of books meant that I was writing very early. I mean, I wrote my first novel in first grade. I'm sure it was just like 3 pages of handwritten that I thought was a novel.
Was it illustrated?
No, I never was going to be the illustrator, right? I thought that, I was like, no, I will hire somebody. I don't know what I was thinking. But I was writing very early. My mother, who didn't raise me, but I knew that she had been a writer and that she was a poet. And I had this idea that I would, my grandmother also wanted to be a writer and became a librarian as a way to kind of keep that literary part of herself alive. My mother wanted to be a writer, but she was really ill and wasn't able to become a writer. So I grew up with this idea that I was going to do it for all 3 of us. And so that was it was always this kind of goal, like, don't worry, guys. I'll make it happen. And I still feel like I've done it for all 3 of us. Yeah.
Did you know what kind of writing you wanted to do, or did you have a different genre that you were like, I'm going to be a romance author?
Yeah, I think the genre thing is nonsense. I mean, I hate to say that. I was just going to curse again. Wow, it's so hard. It's really hard. But I think we were talking about this when we were in the green room, right? That I feel like genre can be ghettoizing. I feel like it's also a way to devalue different kinds of writing. Like, that's not literary, that's blah. That's not literary, that's romance. That's not literary. Like, even that term literary feels problematic to me, even though I often get put in like literary. I feel like it's just like, are you writing well? Who cares, right? Like, if you are a reader, hopefully you like all kinds of stuff. And like, I think our job as people who do marketing or people who are editors is to like bring readers into all of it. And I mean, I would like to be in the dirty romance section, but I end up in like the literary section, whatever that means. So
Is there a dirty romance section?
Sorry?
Is there a dirty romance section?
There is. It's where Danielle is. I want to be with her. But they're not putting me there. But I think, so I didn't know what I was going to write. I just thought I would just write. And I think that's what we should all be doing, I think. Yeah.
Jackson, what about you? When did you know?
This is all I've ever wanted to do was write. I honestly can't remember a time when I didn't. I do have I wrote a novel as well when I was like 8. It is 3 pages, but mine's typed because we had Windows 3.1, and it was a pretty slick machine. And when I wasn't playing Oregon Trail, but yeah, Oregon Trail, man. I died of dysentery a lot. But yeah, I always wanted to write. And what's interesting is I always knew that I was going to write for kids and teens. Like I said, this is my first one that's not. And that was really difficult when I got to college because I was surrounded by people who were like, I'm writing the great literary novel about suffering and pain and hatred. And I was like, I wrote a book about a unicorn. That was really cute. But it really was like, I didn't get taken seriously by a lot of people. And it wasn't until I took an adolescent literature writing class in college that it was the first time that I had seen that genre legitimized. And I became very proud of that. And I was like, yeah, I wrote that. And, your book about suffering sounds like a real downer. So I'm going to read my book about a unicorn. But yeah, I do kind of hate genre divisions. And even like this one, we had trouble, like, is it a romance? Is it Is it literary fiction? Is it women's fiction? Which women's fiction is such a weird, like,
That's
it's
my
such a weird
that's my
term
least
anyway.
favorite
That is
classification. That is an awful one.
Yeah.
And it's very tricky too, because I also do want it to be put where it will sell. And I recognize that means a certain kind of cover and marketing, but at the same time, I hate that. Yeah, it's tricky.
So, Anne, with your Appalachian roots, you probably were born storytelling.
Oh, yeah.
True.
And it got me in trouble a lot.
But when did you know that you wanted to write?
That I wanted to write. Probably when I came home to live with my grandmother. I was very lonely child, you know. It was just so different and so not diverse, and it just was hard on me. I got made fun of because we had lived in Germany, so I was called a Nazi, even though my dad was a World War II hero. It was just it was crazy. And so I think that's when it kind of took over for me. And I would sit my brother, because I would try him out on him, because he was afraid of everything. He liked, I love what is it, Lost in Space, the old black and white TV show. You guys would know it. But
I know it.
You know what I'm talking about.
I'm with you.
And I loved it, and we couldn't watch it because Jeff was afraid of it. And so, you know, we didn't have 10
Afraid
TVs.
of Lost in
Yes,
Space?
he was afraid of the robot.
Does that mean you were like, Jeff's afraid of that? I'll give him something to be afraid
Yeah,
of.
so I would sit him out on the back stoop, and I'd tell him my stories before I would write them down, the ghost stories, and he would go in and my mother would threaten my life and say, "Do not tell him those stories," and it was so much fun.
And then did you get to watch Lost in Space, because at least it was less scary than your stories?
No, never got to watch. I didn't watch Lost in Space until I was a grown up and found old reruns. And he still doesn't read my books. He doesn't.
Man, Jeff.
He doesn't read them.
Together.
Where does your fiction start? Is it a plot or is it
It's
character?
character.
Is it character?
It's a character.
Will they pop into your head?
Yeah, my daughters say that I have issues because they talk to me and they'll just show up. You know, Nellie from Ghost on Black Mountain, when I first started writing, I was emulating, you know, Ellen Gilchrist. I love Ellen Gilchrist.
Yeah, me too.
And of course my work was nothing like hers, but I thought that it was. And then Nellie started talking to me, and here she's this hickey hillbilly from Appalachia, and I'm allowed to say hillbilly because my roots are from there. But I thought, no way I'm writing about her. You know, I'm not writing this. And the first line of Ghost on Black Mountain came through my head. My mama told me not to marry Hobbs Pritchett. She saw death in her tea leaves. And I thought, no way, nobody cares about that stuff. And I had to really argue with it until I wrote a short story called Ghost on Black Mountain.
Wow.
So, yeah, and people liked it. And I thought, oh, they like Appalachian fiction. That's crazy.
Did you call Jeff? Ha! Jeff.
They like ghosts.
So, Jackson, where does it start for you when you sit down to write?
It's usually with a concept. It's funny. I know a lot of authors that feel the character is in their head. I've never felt that way. I've never felt like the character is speaking to me like that. It's usually with a concept that then I think of like what the problem will be or what the situation will be. And then I think about what character would deal with that in the worst way. And then I stick them in that problem and I ruin their lives. So yeah, like for this one, again, it was the idea, like I wanted to tell a story about a pop star I have one of my young adult series it's actually a middle grade series, is called The Double Cross, and it's about a kid who's born to a family of spies, but he is a little bit chunky and he can't pass the physical exam to become, even though he's great at everything else, he can't pass this like ridiculous physical exam they have to become a junior agent. It's not about me in middle school, Jim. It's not. It is. But that mile run, man. It's like Satan's mile. But yeah, so it starts kind of with a concept and then I sort of work a character into it, usually.
Do you know how it ends before you start?
I know the shape of the ending.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I know the general idea of where the ending is, and I know sort of what I want them to come out the other side aware of or knowing. I know the shape of it, but not like the actual I don't know the ending.
And Anne, you're shaking your head. You don't know when
Never.
you start? Never?
Never.
So it comes to you, it evolves?
Right. My second novel, The Story Catcher, it was like I knew I was getting close to the end. I had no clue. I was getting scared. I mean, really, I had no clue. And then I realized when I woke up one morning, I knew, okay, this is how it's going to end. But it gets scary, but that's the only way. I have to write it as if I'm the reader,
Okay.
you know.
So Tiphanie, you talk about this book and how it changed so dramatically. Your first novel, was it the same, or did you know kind of the shape that was going to take and where it was going to end up?
Yeah, I feel like I usually begin with like language is my normal beginning,
Okay.
which is so random, but it's like,
What do you mean, like a quote?
yeah, like maybe I'm a big spy. I like to listen. I'm a snoop. And a big part of my research is just like sitting on the bus or on the train and listening to people. And when people say interesting things and just like, oh, that's dope. How can I write it down? And so sometimes this is like a line of dialogue or a line of narrative that then I want to like continue to like think through. For me, like if I let the language lead me, I mean, even when if I can't feel like I'm going to read it out loud and there's a musicality to it already, I have to keep editing until I can find that musicality so that I can read as if I'm singing. I want to be dancing when I'm reading, right? So I let the language lead me, which means I never really know where it's going. And I want that I'm like Anne, I want my readers to feel that surprise. And I don't know how to get them to feel that surprise if I don't also feel it. So for me, like letting the language lead me, or once I get to characters, letting them kind of do surprising things. If I control them too much, then I can imagine that my readers would also find them predictable. So I kind of like let that roam, which means I have a very messy, super messy process, which is why it takes me so long to write a book.
And what is your process? Do you write every day?
No, I have kids.
Oh, yeah.
No, I have
Never
kids. I'm a
mind.
professor. I have a partner. I have like friends who I love and I'm committed to. You know, I have family members who I have to visit and like call for their birthdays. Yeah, I don't have any sort of thing that writers say, like I wake up every morning, the sun shines, and I drink this cup of coffee and this pen. None of that crap. I have no preciousness about it. I just write whenever I can, whenever there's time. And I don't stress myself out about it. I just do it whenever I can and get it done. And somehow it gets done. But I forgive myself a lot when I don't write. Which I think is also part of it. Like forgiving, like not stressing when I'm not writing. It benefits me to have a job. Which I really encourage writers to have, is to have a job that's not your writing, which means you can allow your writing to just like be as beautiful and honest and like take its time as you can and not be too dependent on like the editor who's like, I need you to do this so that you can pay your bills. For me, like because I have a job that pays my bills, I can let the writing like come when it comes.
Okay.
I was talking about that in the green room actually before. Yeah, that are you writing full time?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's hard. I can't do it.
That I did it for a few years, and yeah, honestly, it sucks. Like I'm not gonna. There's this like I'm a full-time writer. It was not fun. It was the most stressful time of my life because there was a lot of like I have to write this book right now in 30. I wrote multiple books in 30 days because there was one. I think my fourth book. The publisher didn't buy it until they were like, okay, we do want it after all. And it needs to be, we need it by the end of the month. You've been working on it, right? And I was like, no, you didn't pay for it. Like but I had to do it or not get paid. And I needed to get paid. It's a lot of stress on your creativity.
Tell me about your process, Anne.
For me, I don't depend on my book money to live off of, or I'd be, in what my grandmother would have said, the poorhouse. I mean, seriously, that's not. Yeah, so I have a wonderful husband, and he's not there. He left. And, there he is back there.
There he is.
He's there. He's still wonderful.
And I also am retired.
Okay,
so I can do that. When I worked for BP Oil as a technical writer and wrote my first book on my lunch hour in an empty office every day. So yeah, that's, when you put too much pressure on your writing, it takes away the art of it, the love of it. And so I won't do that. So I agree with you 100% on that.
When you're in the zone, do you find that you want to write for 8 or 10 hours at a time?
No.
Or you never get to that zone?
No. At the most I've ever written is in one. Now I've researched that long because I love research.
Do you?
Yeah, because it keeps you from writing. and if you're a history freak,
Okay.
you know, it's just you jump into the research and you learn all this stuff you don't need. I mean, you put it aside and say, one day I'm going to write a book about that. Yeah, but no, 4 hours is my top, and I have to do something different, and that's on a good day.
That seems healthy.
Yeah, for sure. I have to read sometime too, and I do teach a master class, fiction class online. So.
Do you? Okay. Do you like teaching?
Yes, I love it. I teach grown-ups that call themselves grown-ups, and they love me. Carolyn Curry's down there, and we've worked together, and she just got her first novel published with Mercer.
Yay.
Yeah. She's here this afternoon, but this evening. But yeah, so I love it. It feeds. I'm kind of like you. It feeds. It makes me want to write after working with my students because they have such. They're just really good.
Okay.
And I enjoy it.
So what are you working on next?
I am almost ready to turn in a nonfiction book about Lucille Seeley Frank, which was Leo Frank's wife.
Leo Frank's wife. Wow. Tell us about that.
Well, she's just kind of, I'll be the first woman that's ever written about this particular subject, except for Mary Fagan's great niece, and that's more to me like a memoir than it is just coming to it fresh. But, and so I'm bringing a woman's point of view to it, and Lucille was ignored. You find very little on her. In the papers back then, she just kind of, and when you did find her, she was hysterical, or she broke down, or she was dying, or those kind of things.
Tell people the real quick version of Leo Frank and what the story is.
Leo Frank was from New York. He was the National Pencil Factory in Atlanta at the time, and he was the superintendent there, and he was accused of murdering Mary Fagan, who was a 13-year-old from Marietta, which is my hometown. And he was found guilty, and then he was not pardoned, but he was commuted from his death sentence to a life in prison because the governor did not want to let him go because they would have killed him if they let him go completely, which they still did. They did some of the most upper echelon in the government of Cobb County put together, and that's an interesting thing, but they put together a whole group that went down, and within minutes they had him, and they never fired a shot, and they brought him back and hung him. And the reason I know about it is my grandmother. This was one of the stories that she told. She never let me know. I found out later in my research that she actually, her father took her to see Leo Frank hanging after, and I didn't know that, but there was a certain detail she told me, so that when I started researching, I realized, oh my God, the only people that saw that were people that were taken to see it. And they brought kids. I mean, there was picnics. I got pictures of picnics taking place, and this man, of course, he was by that point gone from there, but they had come to see him. And it's just, it's turned into more than just Lucille. Now it became, I found out a lot about Mary and her family and how she was so sexualized when she was this child. She was a child.
God, what a great
girl.
project.
Yeah.
When's publication?
Well, when I get it turned in, it'll be about a year from there.
Okay.
year and a
future.
half. Yes.
So you can put forthcoming.
It's my goal
Yeah.
to give it to my publisher by the end of November.
Okay. Jackson, what are you working on next?
Speaking of writing processes, there's a sequel to this book. This is my thinly veiled Taylor Swift. It's my thinly veiled Selena Gomez book, and it was due last summer.
So
it's
right on schedule.
Still not turned in, y'all. Again, my whole writing process got so thrown off by and like all of the things that I did previously. So I'm working on that. I keep starting and restarting it. My poor editor, she's been incredibly generous with time. And then I'm also working on a kid series about a little girl who lives in a hotel for ghosts.
Oh,
And
cool.
yeah, that one's really fun. It's really charming. So I'm working on that one as well. That one is not officially coming out anywhere as of yet, but it is what I'm working on all the same.
Okay, Tiffany?
My books take me a long time to write, but somehow I still have 5 books out already. And it's because I'm normally working on multiple books at the same time, which is also why I never have writer's block. If I feel blocked, I just go to another project. I don't stress about it. So I mentioned the essays that I'm working on about parenting and COVID-19. I'm working on a novel about men and homes. Like this, I know that doesn't, who cares about that? But I have this idea that men get really, especially men of a certain age, get really obsessed with their houses. And so I'm working on a novel about masculinity and home building.
Really?
And right now in my mind, it's like 3 men of 3 different generations, and it's gonna be the same house, but they're all, they're not related to each other. They just all end up owning the house at different points in history. So I'm just doing, a lot of that is in research. I'm just doing research now. Like I get down in the research, like on architecture and like research on like homes in Atlanta, homes in the Caribbean. And so I'm working on that. And then I'm working on a book of poems about colonialism and marriage and how those 2 things might be connected. And then I'm also working on a book about single moms during the pandemic who went crazy, as many of us single moms did. But how the sort of sisterhood of mothers can like save us. So that's also like a fun novel.
And then what do you do in the afternoons?
I raise children.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're out of time. Y'all have been delightful. Thanks for being here. Thank you all for being here. See, we didn't even have time for Q&A.
Thank you, Teresa.
They'll be signing books afterward?
And we'll answer
Back
questions.
here.
We'll answer your questions.
We will
Yeah,
answer questions.
Q&A.